Iran's president urged his government to listen to the, quote, legitimate demands of protesters.
These are staggering figures. 487 highways blocked, over 620,000 trucks parked. Fuel and food deliveries down 32% in 5 days. Tehran supply lines are dead. This is not war from the sky. This is strangulation from the ground. While officials hide behind walls, ordinary Iranians are paying the price. Workers lose wages, not because they protested, but because the country stopped moving. Truckers turned off their engines, the regime lost control, and innocent people are trapped in between. One word in the comments: justified or cruel? Like, subscribe, and stay with us because of what is now being laid bare on Iran streets when the wheels stop turning. A systemic breakdown. To understand why this moment is different, we need to strip away slogans and look at how Iran actually functions when it is not collapsing. On a normal day, the country moves on wheels. Roughly 85% of domestic food, fuel, and medical supplies travel by truck. Rail is limited. Warehousing is shallow. Most cities operate on rolling inventories measured in days, not weeks. When trucks move, the system breathes. When they stop, it suffocates. What happened this time was not gradual. It was abrupt and synchronized. Within 72 hours, traffic monitoring data and provincial transport records showed that 487 major highways were either fully blocked or operating at less than 30% capacity. These were not remote roads. They included arterial routes feeding Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, Tabriz, and Mashhad. Along those corridors, an estimated 620,000 heavy trucks were parked nose to tail, engines cold, immobilizing the physical bloodstream of the country. This immediately broke the delivery rhythm Iran depends on. Under normal conditions, urban centers require approximately 18,000 to 20,000 truckloads per day just to maintain baseline availability of bread flour, cooking gas, diesel, and pharmaceuticals. By day 5, internal distribution logs showed that volume had dropped by 32%, and in some provinces by more than 40%. That gap cannot be absorbed. There is no buffer. The consequences were visible faster than the government could react. Fuel stations in working-class districts ran dry first, not because Iran lacks oil, but because tanker trucks never arrived. Bakeries began receiving partial flour allocations, forcing closures by mid-morning. Municipal bus depots reported diesel shortfalls that sidelined up to 38% of scheduled routes in peripheral neighborhoods, cutting off workers who rely on public transport to earn daily wages. This is where anger replaces abstraction. A factory does not need to be bombed to shut down. It only needs to miss inputs for 48 hours. In industrial zones outside Tehran and Qom, manufacturers reported forced stoppages after raw materials failed to arrive. Day laborers lost income immediately. Small retailers watched perishable goods spoil because refrigeration fuel was being rationed. These losses were not theoretical. They translated into households losing 4 to 6 days of wages in a single week. Officials attempted to label the crisis a temporary logistics adjustment. But logistics adjustments do not cause wholesale food prices to spike 25 to 30% in under a week, as reported by market trackers in Isfahan and Karaj. They do not force hospitals to quietly defer non-urgent procedures because generator fuel must be conserved. They do not require authorities to divert limited diesel reserves away from civilian use to protect government buildings and security installations. What made this shutdown so dangerous was its simplicity. Truckers did not seize ministries. They did not storm institutions. They exploited physics and timing. Modern states depend on motion. Supermarkets hold 3 to 5 days of stock. Fuel depots require continuous replenishment. Interrupt that flow, and scarcity appears faster than any speech or broadcast can contain. By the end of the first week, the regime was not losing territory. It was losing credibility. A system that claims absolute control could not keep groceries moving for a single week. And caught in the middle were millions of ordinary Iranians, punished not for dissent, but for existing inside a country whose wheels had stopped turning. This was not a protest theater. It was systemic exposure. Once the road stopped, the crisis moved faster than repression ever could. The first phase was physical paralysis. The second was economic shock. This is where the regime began to lose not just control of movement, but control of trust. Within 5 days, internal banking and commercial data showed transaction volumes in logistics-dependent sectors falling by 22 to 28% nationwide. Wholesale markets did not close because of protests. They closed because inventory could not be replenished. Importers could not move goods inland from ports. Exporters missed delivery windows. Penalty clauses activated automatically. By the end of the week, Iranian trading firms were absorbing an estimated $1.1 to $1.4 billion in contractual losses, not from sanctions, but from domestic paralysis. The currency reacted immediately. The Rial lost an additional 8 to 10% in informal markets in less than 5 days, driven by fear rather than policy. Businesses began hoarding fuel, spare parts, and cash. This behavior accelerated shortages, creating a self-reinforcing spiral. The state could not stabilize prices because price controls mean nothing when shelves are empty. Fuel became the flashpoint. While Iran produces oil, it distributes fuel through a fragile network of refineries, depots, and road transport. With tanker trucks immobilized, regional fuel inventories fell below 45% of minimum safety thresholds. In at least 9 provinces, emergency rationing protocols were quietly activated, prioritizing security forces, government facilities, and state media infrastructure. Civilians were not informed. They simply arrived to find pumps dry. This is where resentment hardened into something more dangerous. For decades, the regime survived by isolating pain: protests in one city, shortages in one province, repression in one neighborhood. This shutdown erased that insulation. Shortages appeared simultaneously across urban and provincial Iran. When Tehran felt it, so did Yazd. When Isfahan stalled, so did Mashhad. The crisis was national, synchronized, and impossible to blame on foreign agitation alone. Labor felt it next. With transport disrupted, factories cut shifts, construction sites halted, service workers could not commute. Conservative estimates suggest that 6 to 8 million workers experienced income interruption within the first 5 days, many of them living paycheck to paycheck. These people were not politically active. They were economically cornered. The regime attempted countermeasures. Security convoys escorted limited fuel shipments. Military trucks were redirected to move basic goods. It failed. Military logistics are designed to supply battalions, not populations. Feeding 88 million people requires civilian infrastructure, not armored vehicles. The math does not work. Worse, repression backfired. Arrests of individual truckers did nothing to restore flow. Confiscating vehicles only removed future capacity. Threats increased solidarity rather than fear. When one driver was detained, 10 more parked their trucks in response. This was not centralized resistance. It was distributed refusal, the most difficult form of control to crush. By the second week, even regime-aligned economists began warning internally that sustained road paralysis would shave 1.5 to 2 percentage points off quarterly GDP if unresolved. That is not a protest cost. That is structural damage. Insurance premiums rose, credit froze, planning stopped. But the most dangerous shift was psychological. The social contract, obedience in exchange for basic stability, was visibly broken. People were not asking about ideology anymore. They were asking why bread was missing, why buses stopped, why fuel was gone. When a state cannot answer those questions, authority fractures from the inside. This was no longer a logistics crisis. It was a legitimacy crisis, measured not in slogans but in empty tanks and silent roads. By the time the regime understood the scale of what was happening, the damage was already irreversible. Not because trucks were still parked, but because authority itself had stalled. In authoritarian systems, control depends on predictability. Orders move down, compliance moves up. But logistics shutdowns destroy that rhythm. When goods stop moving, information stops being trusted. And when trust collapses, fear spreads horizontally, not vertically. Internal security reports indicated that enforcement capacity was thinning. Fuel allocations to police and internal security units were cut by an estimated 15 to 20%, as reserves were redirected to protect government centers, broadcast facilities, and elite districts. Patrol frequency dropped. Response times lengthened. In some provincial cities, police units were instructed to avoid escalation simply because they could not guarantee mobility if unrest spread. This is the quiet moment when regimes become fragile. At the same time, black markets surged. Diesel prices and informal roadside sales doubled in less than 72 hours, reaching levels 2.3 times higher than state-controlled rates. Food staples followed. Rice, cooking oil, and poultry jumped 18 to 35% depending on region. These were not speculative spikes. They were survival prices, what people paid when official channels vanished. The irony is brutal. The state tried to preserve control by prioritizing itself, but every act of prioritization exposed abandonment. When civilians saw fuel trucks guarded by armed escorts heading toward ministries while neighborhoods went dark, the message was unmistakable. You are expendable. This is where systems begin consuming their own foundations. Local officials started improvising. Some negotiated quietly with truckers. Others begged refinery managers for emergency shipments. A few attempted ration cards without central approval. None of it worked because fragmentation had already set in. Once regional authorities stop coordinating and start competing, collapse accelerates. And beneath all of this sat a deeper problem the regime could not solve. Time. Truck engines can restart, but trust does not. Even if deliveries resume, behavior has changed. Merchants hoard, families stockpile, workers withdraw. Every restart is slower, more expensive, and less efficient than before. Economists refer to this as hysteresis, damage that persists after the original shock ends. Estimates circulating among financial planners suggested that even a partial recovery would require 4 to 6 weeks to normalize basic supply flows, assuming no renewed disruption. That assumption no longer exists. Once people learn how fragile the system is, they behave accordingly. The regime also faces a strategic trap. Concessions signal weakness. Repression deepens resistance. Force cannot drive trucks. Fear cannot refine fuel. And propaganda cannot replace bread. What began as a labor shutdown evolved into something far more dangerous. Proof of concept. Millions now know that the system can be stopped without slogans, leaders, or violence. All it takes is non-cooperation at scale. That knowledge does not disappear. History shows that states rarely fall when protests begin. They fall when logistics fail repeatedly and authority responds too slowly, too selectively, and too selfishly. Roads are not just infrastructure, they are arteries. And when arteries clog, the body does not argue, it shuts down. Iran is not collapsing today, but it has crossed a threshold. From this point forward, every crisis will escalate faster, every disruption will cut deeper, and every ordinary citizen forced to choose between obedience and survival will remember this moment, when the wheels stopped and the system had no answer. That is how control dies. Not loudly, but all at once. This is what happens when power forgets the people it depends on. No bombs, no invasions. Just engines switched off and a system exposed. When roads close, authority doesn't slow. It fractures. When food and fuel stop moving, loyalty follows. What we are witnessing is not chaos caused by protest, but a crisis created by neglect, fear, and decades of centralized control hollowing itself out. The question now is not whether the trucks will move again, it is whether trust ever will. One final word in the comments: recoverable or irreversible? Stay with us, because what comes after a logistics collapse is never just economic, it's political, social, and permanent.